Okay, great. So thanks everyone for coming along to my talk. I appreciate for those of you in the UK that that it's kind of a little bit late, and hopefully some people from the US are logging on as well, and hopefully you kind of enjoy this presentation, this keynote. And thank you, Arno, for the introduction, and thank you to the conference for inviting me to present and to give this keynote. So the title of my talk is kind of exploring the online identity and really looking at opportunities versus security and privacy risk. This is a little bit different to the traditional focus on pure kind of cybersecurity and situational awareness, but I believe the topic of identity is more and more important, and it kind of transcends a lot of these discussions that we're having. So this talk really kind of focuses on understanding kind of this notion or the nature of online identity more, exploring it particularly in terms of the positives and the potential negatives. So basically the opportunities and the risk. So the first question of probably that's worth considering is what is an identity? You know, how we talk about identity all the time. We discuss this topic in various different domains, in cyber, in psychology, in various different domains. So the question, of course, that one may start off with is what is an identity? One way you might consider an identity is basically to look at basically almost like the characteristics determining what or who an individual is. Now, if I had to ask, for instance, this question, who is this? And how did you determine their identity? Probably we would quickly start looking at, okay, well, what's the person wearing? Who do they look like? And very quickly, you'd probably kind of come up with, okay, well, based on how the person is dressed and the S on the chest, you'll get this idea of, oh, maybe the identity of this person is Superman, for instance. But then if I ask you this question, who is the identity of this person? Then all of a sudden, once again, you start to look for hints, for characteristics, for features. And maybe this one's a little bit more complicated, but if you know the film, you'll know that this is Clark Kent. So the point here is that you can consider the fact that the characteristics of this thing, or whether it's an individual or a thing itself, can help you kind of give hints about what the identity is, or what the kind of nature of this element is, or this individual or thing is. So if we kind of focus on identity and we really focus on drilling down into what an identity is, what we can consider is this nature of identity context. And there are four kind of main areas that one might delve into. There's kind of biographic data elements. So for example, name, date of birth, age, for instance. There's biometric elements, and this is kind of focuses more on fingerprints, hand geometry, gait, iris scans, and so on. Then you can also consider psychological data elements such as personality profile, level of introversion, and different aspects such as that, which are more and more used in areas such as inside threat detection, for instance. And then you also kind of have this kind of almost all-encompassing or somewhat overlapping aspect of digital or cyber or online data elements, and this covers a vast number of things, including usernames, website profiles, basically any information about us that might actually overlap with the other domains above about our online or digital presence. Now, when we kind of focus on drill down into digital identity and what it is, when we talk about the perceptions of identity, very quickly we start to maybe focus a little bit on our online profiles. So basically the profiles that we have on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and so on. A lot of these kind of focus on what might be our identity. This is kind of typically perception you get from individuals in discussing what is an identity. Probably the other area to kind of pinpoint, especially from a security perspective, is this notion of, well, identity, online identity. Well, you're starting to think about maybe logging in, or what's my identity on a certain platform. And very quickly, you start to consider things such as, let's say, your Google account, your Microsoft account, your Facebook account. And those three in particular, when you think about it, they really, in many ways, define what maybe your online identity may be, especially because they allow you to control so much of your online identity. For instance, platforms such as Google or rather services that provided by Google and Microsoft, not only do they provide email, they provide very different online services, and they kind of almost tend, in many ways, actually, they're sort of becoming one-stop shops. And the same in some regards for Facebook, but much more from a kind of social network perspective. And then, of course, you have the other side when it comes to identity, and it's somewhat slightly different, where you have things like Google Authenticator, which is provides often basically the second factor of authentication. You have a number of different alliances, and you also have these kind of basically second factor authentication keys. And you have voice biometrics, you have fingerprint biometrics. These are more and more used when it comes to kind of pursuing or defining what might be someone's online identity. But the way how I want to approach this talk is actually to break down identity even further. I want to focus on online identity as an active identity, something we actually generally create. And then also focus on online identity as something that's maybe a bit more passive in terms of something that's actually created on our behalf, which we might or might not actually know much about. And then from there, we'll kind of extract what are the kind of potential risks and opportunities surrounding that. So if we focus on online identity in terms of active identity, what we actually actively create online, we did some research well, 4 years ago now, seems like quite a while, in that we kind of analyzed kind of how the individual's online presence and try to really understand how do individuals represent themselves online. And we try to model that in somewhat intelligent way. Now, how we did this is to basically say, okay, well, each of us are individuals offline. And we also have what we call online persona. Now, online persona is basically this thing that kind of is manifested of somewhat of our offline presence. And it might actually match our real offline presence, or it might be slightly different. So once you have this online persona that we all create, kind of representing ourselves, that online persona can have a number of different profiles. And you can see the profiles here where everyone might have a Facebook profile, a Twitter profile, a Flickr profile. You can also have profiles related to work or to more fun activities. So you might have a LinkedIn profile. You might have a profile created for you. For example, us academics, we all tend to almost have university web pages. You can also have profiles related to sales. So for example, eBay, Yelp, TripAdvisor, Amazon, and all these are different profiles that actually might map that, that persona. Under that, these profiles can be associated with different contexts, so social context, work context, and so on. And then under that, you basically can have a number of different, well, let's just call them general elements. So general things that actually represent, in a much more granular fashion, that actually represent us as individuals. So for example, age, height, display picture, and so on. And this is one way you might actually conceptualize what is an online identity via this idea of an online persona. Now, if we kind of, to show an example of that, and especially an example where we actually have an individual that might have different online, the same individual offline that might have different online persona. Let's take, for example, Robert Smith here, 26, Oxford academic. He has an online persona where he uses Facebook for social activities, but also for a bit of work. He uses LinkedIn for work, Oxford University profile, once again linked to work. Then under that, there are a number of different elements. For example, they could his Oxford University profile could actually explain a bit more about him in terms of what research he's interested in, or his contact information in terms of work email, and so on and so forth. Now, Robert might also have a separate profile, and this profile here, online persona 2, might actually be very different to the other profile he has online. So in this profile now, Robert is referred to as Jungle Droid. He has a profile on eBay and on Amazon. And also, as you recognize, there is a very different age to what his true age is. And once again, this kind of represents this idea that as individuals kind of use online platforms, they can actually build persona that are maybe completely different. And some of them may be more or less representative of who that individual actually is in the offline world. And then, of course, each of these can have much more specific data elements related to them. Now, with that kind of general understanding of active online identity, now I'll focus a little bit on the passive identity that's actually created for us on our behalves and just by using the internet. So this is some research I have been involved in, but I thought it was very interesting, where they basically tried to model the different ways in which online identities are created for individuals. And they delved into a number of different focuses, such as considering things like device information, browser type, IP address. And this is kind of information that's more or less gathered, and we don't contribute this actively. This is actually gathered on our behalf just by using different platforms. For example, here, using this device, we automatically share our browser type, hardware version, and so on. And here's a bit more information on that as well. So all these are more in the context of the research done by ShareLab on Facebook. Now, another thing that probably is worth finding out, I'll probably encourage individuals, if they've never done this before, is take a look at your, there's a link on your screen, facebook.com/ads/preferences. And so you'll be able to get a kind of a screen to basically understand a little bit more about how Facebook views your identity. And this may be based on things that you have added directly to your profile, but it also might be based on inferences made on the data you share and how you've actually engaged on their platform. So that's actually really interesting because it can be very insightful in understanding, once again, this idea of a passive identity. Another way to actually consider this idea is to think about biometric behavior. So this is an interesting bit of work, and it's a little bit dated now, but it's actually kind of, and don't think a lot of people recognize this, and I think it's very, very interesting. So the title of this article, as you can see, is Keyboard Strokes and Smartphone Swipes Used by Banks to Detect Fraud. And the basic idea here is that a number of banks, in this instance, NatWest is mentioned, a number of banks actually are able to monitor how you use certain devices when you're logged into their services, whether it's, let's say, a browser or whatever, or even on mobile phone. And they use this to kind of build a profile on you, on the users, for example, or the individuals, the customers that use their services. Now, the benefit of this, or how they use this, is to basically, if someone else actually gains access to that device, or someone is trying to impersonate this individual, the bank in this instance could actually basically detect that this profile that they've modeled, that they've built, is very different to the profile that is now trying to access the services. So in this instances, there could be, let's say, a second factor of authentication requested, or the individual actually blocked from logging into the account. And once again, this is not an identity this is not data that we actively create. This is data that is actually created based on our engagement with services and used in this instance to actually help us and assist us in actually engaging with this online service. So now I touched a bit on the active elements, the active identity and the passive identity. I want to focus a little bit now on the opportunities, and particularly those that I've worked on, I know kind of quite a bit about. So one area that we actually try to focus on is this idea of using the online identity for applications in law enforcement and potentially detecting fraudulent persona. So this actually follows on a little bit from the example I just gave with respect to the banks. What we did was we did some research to, once again, use a model that we identified before to model people's online presence. And then we decided that, well, it might actually be quite interesting to take this model of people's online, basically almost like a structure or a template of sorts of what people expose online, and gather a set of individuals and maybe a set of similar individuals and try to see if we can define almost a normal template, what we call kind of a natural template for representing certain types of individuals. So we did a little bit of a research study where we gathered a number of individuals. We basically collected a lot of data on their online presence, as defined in the, similar to the example I gave prior with Robert Smith. And we tried to mold the online presence. And then from that, we tried to distill, okay, are there certain aspects that are occurring more frequently than others? So we basically tried to use their online presence to basically build almost like a supervised learning model. But we didn't use supervised learning. This was we didn't use machine learning for this example. Now, the hypothesis that we put forward was that we can take this model that we build, or this template, this natural template of a set of individuals, and then if a new individual comes in and a new individual claims to be of that particular type, then we can compare that individual to that type to determine if the individual is fraudulent or not. Now, where this is very, very fundamentally different to existing research is existing research focuses only on one platform. So existing research would focus just on Facebook or on Twitter or on, let's say, the banking context. Where our work was tried to be quite novel was to actually expand and just say, well, let's actually look at their complete online presence and try to understand what's being exposed, what's being shared, how are they using these platforms, and then use that to detect potentially fraudulent persona. Now, here's kind of basically some summary findings from that work. So here you would see that, for instance, based on the individuals, so in this study, we had, I think it's about 50 individuals. And we tried to model, oh, sorry, we have 35 individuals. And we tried to model that presence. So from this graph, you can see that, for instance, most individuals used Facebook. Facebook was very popular at that point in time. Most individuals also use Amazon. However, few individuals use, let's say, Last.fm or Pinterest. Similarly, we actually kind of did a little bit of a deep dive into certain platforms. So on the other side of the screen, you basically can see a deep dive down into Facebook in particular, where we're trying to explore, well, do certain individuals expose certain data or share certain data typically on Facebook compared to, let's say, another individual. And what we did here was basically we tried to build templates. So what we would say, for instance, is we would expect an individual of this type to have a Facebook account because based on our analysis, individuals of this type are much more likely to have a Facebook account, whereas the opposite for something like Last.fm. So if we had an individual that the structure of their online presence was very, very different to maybe the templates that we identified, one might say, for instance, that individual not necessarily might be fraudulent, but at least they deserve a little bit of a second look. We also did this. We tried to apply machine learning to this problem as well, because the analysis prior was largely manual, and that was simply because we had a number of different features, but the data set, like I said, it was only 35 individuals, so it was a quite small data set. But what we tried to do was try to apply PCA to it, to the feature. So basically try to drill down and to plot it out to see whether there's anything at all we can try to gain from a machine learning model. And what we found was, unfortunately, that there wasn't much there. We think that this links a bit to the fact that the data set was so small and there was a fair amount of variance in that small amount of data. Another thing we actually did was, so this is kind of much more of a simplistic analysis. What we did was we explored just how much individuals used the Facebook platform. So on the left, you see basically, we basically monitored something as simple as when individuals tend to post the most. Now, for this demographic that we analyzed, and more detail can be found in the article, we found that basically most individuals tend to post in where's kind of the orange. Most individuals tend to post around 8 p.m., where they were very unlikely to post, let's say, at other periods of time. So this is a clock, basically. This is the hours of the day. So we did that analysis over a day. And once again, the idea here was that if we had a profile where the post timing was extremely different, then maybe that individual or those set of individuals were not of that particular type. So maybe they're potentially fraudulent. Now, the key thing with this analysis that we found was that it's very, very important to clearly define what the type is, because this is a very, very difficult problem, because you have to be relatively certain that the type of individuals you have, there will be enough similarity in them to be able to extract what we call this kind of naturalness template and basically the way how you might use these online identities. Now, another bit of work that I've been involved in was, and this is not necessarily linked to that online identity where I just mentioned, but this is somewhat a little bit different in that, once again, thinking about applications of online identity, how we can explore this in the context of law enforcement. What we tried to do was, we're very interested in kind of the spread of online activists on Facebook and how they were kind of using Facebook and how they were engaged. So we basically, we were able to get access to a data set of activists on Facebook. And what we tried to do is basically to try to identify the key players in this group in terms of posts, in terms of interactions, in terms of, let's say, who were the most central individuals in the network. So what you see on the screen right now is a model of that based on kind of social network analysis, where we try to where we try to model individuals in terms of their posts. So the connections between individuals are posts or replies to posts, I should say. And this is a directed graph. So you'll see, for instance, for example, I should mention that the width of the arrows is basically how many times those individuals interacted. Each node is an individual. And the size of the nodes represent how much incoming information, right? It's the in degree of those particular nodes. So from this image, you'll see, for instance, that user 33 and user 74, I believe, are kind of the key ones in this network. Now, what we also try to do is basically to apply some clustering to that. So what we were, like I said, what we were interested in here is how can we use people's online identity? How can we use this to maybe, in this instance, support law enforcement? And what we could quickly see when we apply some clustering analysis to this social network graph is that we can actually quite quickly see who were the key individuals of the network and who were the most connected individuals. And for instance, if law enforcement was interested in disrupting this network, or if in this instance Facebook was interested in disrupt this network, the key individuals, the key players could be identified, and those could potentially be extracted from this network. So this is what this research is really all about, in trying to help understand who are the key players, potentially, of course, what are they doing, and then who are the individuals, if they were extracted from this network, that might basically cause the network to break down. Now, another kind of, once again, thinking about positives of opportunities of online identities is, of course, this idea of targeted marketing. And targeted marketing is clearly the most, or potentially the most lucrative of all of these. So here's just a website I went to a few days ago, and of course, the first thing that popped up here in the UK is this idea of kind of the new government's campaign around coronavirus and in terms of test and trace. So I was on a football website, and there was a lot of information here. Of course, probably even about half of the content of this page, at least based on this screenshot, is actually not about why it went to this website in the first place. And this highlights not necessarily immediately an issue, but at least highlights the ability to kind of target individuals in a way that, of course, has been done for many years now, but is very, very different to the idea of, let's say, posting in a news posting an advert in a newspaper and hoping that individuals read it, or a billboard somewhere. Now, of course, the reality with targeted marketing, especially online, is that it's big business, right? It's massive business. Google and Facebook, as you can see here, are two of the more significant players. There's a lot of money to be made, and this is just one study, and this is even a little bit dated. You know, this isn't 2020 work. But the point here is that there's a lot of money to be made, and especially in terms of target advertising, where individuals may, in the instance just now, we had individuals could be targeted based on the fact that they're in the UK and there's this new government campaign and trying to get individuals to kind of come on board and follow and understand what's happening. So there's kind of clearly positives to that side as well, and Facebook and Google are kind of two of the biggest parties when it comes to supporting that ecosystem. Now, a lot of my work has also focused not only on understanding what the positives are and how we can actually use identities for good, but also thinking about what are some of the negatives. How can these online identities that we create or that are created for us can actually expose us to a variety of different risks. The first one I'll probably flash up really quickly is, we all seen these news items, these articles, the internet knows you better than your spouse does, online profiling and invasion of privacy, the myth of anonymization, and so on and so forth. So this is clearly a big concern, and it's a concern that has worried a lot of people for a lot of time, especially when it comes to the creation of these passive identities and the sharing of information that we kind of do online. Now, focusing on the active identity, this is one of the more funny quotes I like to have a look at every now and then. So it says, given the fact that you did update your Facebook status saying you brush your teeth, I'm a little worried that you didn't. And then, of course, on the other side, this is another one, and it focuses really on looking at social media and the fact that, of course, we've really significantly changed how we've kind of interacted online, in that we post quite significantly. In this example, we have social media being explained from simple perspective of different platforms and how we actually interact with them and how we share almost every detail of our lives. And of course, there are positives to that from some extent in terms of being as open as you want, sharing information with friends and family and so on. There's also a number of risks related to this level of sharing when it comes to social media and individuals' social media presence. Now, probably the first bit of work that I'll mention here that I've been involved in, and this is going back a little while now, is thinking about ways in which we can actually model identity risk, and thinking about ways in which we can understand what personal information is available and how that information can actually be used against individuals, especially when it comes to online information, so information about an individual's online identity, and how that might actually be used against them. So what we did in this work was we tried to understand the variety of personal information available online. Then we actually tried to research and define techniques that allow this information to be linked. And this is actually looking at even simplistic things such as if someone shares their name on Twitter and someone shares their date of birth on Facebook, then an attacker, a criminal, a malevolent individual might actually start to combine this information to make kind of informed guesses to infer more information. And the key thing is here that this wasn't only based on inferences that we could come up with. This is based a lot of academic research. So for the other example here, when there's the names of these individuals, there was an article many years ago that basically talks about, well, they basically show that if someone knows enough about that's your kind of close friend circle, then they can make inferences almost directly about you, whether it pertains to your age or age group or age range, whether it pertains to your location, whether it pertains to what video games you play, your job, and so on. Now, the last thing was actually trying to take all these kind of small inferences, all these small aspects, and to tie them together in a much more complete model. And we did this, and we did this to a fair extent, looking at actually across a lot of data exposed online, and kind of built up some very interesting inferences about what could be inferred about individuals if attackers are able to get their hands on certain bits of information. Now, I'll give you a very simplistic example here. So let's assume that we have John K. Smith, and that's his name. Now, let's assume that let's assume that you can guess John K. Smith's username just based on knowing his or her name. So in this instance, you can guess that John K. Smith's username may be J.K. Smith, for instance. Of course, the confidence in this might vary, especially depending on the individual, but it might be, let's say, it's somewhat of an informed or educated guess. Now, we can also guess that if we search for John K. Smith, especially something like John K. Smith, even though John Smith is, potentially definitely not an easy name to pin on an individual on. John K. Smith is a little bit more targeted, it's a bit more direct, it's a bit more informative. So let's say we're able to search for John K. Smith on LinkedIn, and we actually find a John K. Smith or the John K. Smith. Now, the next thing you can do by applying our model is well, if you have someone's username, then you could potentially make inferences about what their usernames are, where they made their profiles on different social networking platforms. So for instance, if you know the person uses J.K. Smith, then you might make a guess that maybe their Twitter name is J.K. Smith, or the Twitter handle is J.K. Smith. You might also make that same inference for Facebook. Now, once again, the key thing here is that I'm making the assumption that some of these will be correct, some of these may be incorrect, but the point is that you can actually make these initial inferences. Now, if you go to the LinkedIn example, if you know that someone's a LinkedIn profile, in some regards, this is a gold mine, because people on their LinkedIn profile, people are a little bit more skeptical about lying, because they figure that, if they lie there and a potential employer reaches out to them and then they're discovered to be maybe fraudulent or not telling the truth, then that kind of ruins that relationship. So here you can actually see, okay, well, if you can get someone LinkedIn profile, then you might actually be able to find out where they work. You can also potentially find out maybe their education, so their background, a little bit about their educational past. That could be informative for an attacker. And I'll show you why. So moving on, if we kind of look at the next level of inferences, so once again, applying the model that we developed, then you can say, well, if you know someone's Twitter profile, then, in some regards, that's also a gold mine, because on Twitter, people tend to tweet what they're doing, what they're involved in. And in this instance, if the person said, I'm out with the guys, that initially tells you that the person is not at home, for instance. Now, if we assume that on Facebook, the person also shared, if we assume we were to reach the person's Facebook and they're also shared their home address, their family members, their date of birth, then all of a sudden you actually see a much more richer data set. So Facebook is actually another really good one from an attacker's perspective to get your hands on, which is why it really comes down to protecting yourselves against oversharing on these platforms. So if we go down to the LinkedIn example, then we have more information. You have information from the developer. You can know their location, you can know their work email address, and so on. So you can continue this point, but then the key thing is that as you try to unpack these different areas, you try to understand actually there's a number of different risks here. If you expose your home address, there's this risk of stalking. If you expose the names of your family members and your date of birth, then there's this issue of password recovery and maybe someone hacking into your account. And that's from the perspective that we all create passwords based on what we know. Potentially people forget passwords based on family members' names and so on, or date of births. So that information might actually be used to guess your password. Then there's also information, if we look at the LinkedIn example, if someone knows where you work, if they know your email address, all these bits of information can be combined actually to launch spear phishing attacks, stalking attacks, and so on. And the kind of last one kind of generally being, if someone knows where you are and someone knows where you live and they know you're not at home, then the classic example is home burglary. So this model, in trying to apply it, really tries to explore how we can actually highlight to individuals and do some interesting analytics on if someone shares just a bit of information on them, how we can actually infer other things, or how other things can be inferred. Now, we followed up on this work with a bit more of a directed study, not only focused on social media data, but trying to also incorporate things like the IoT, especially fitness trackers. So one thing we recognized was that, of course, people overshare on social media. We know this for quite a long time. There's a lot of research in this domain. But what we've recognized more and more is that people are also oversharing when it comes to fitness tracker data. So much more people have fitness trackers these days, and they use different fitness tracker apps, whether it be Strava, Fitbit, and so on. So what we recognized was that we analyzed the data that people were actually sharing, and we found that there's a number of different aspects that people might share. So the key question for us was, what if individuals actually started to combine, what if potentially an attacker tried to combine these different bits of information? What risks might that pose to individuals? And whether it be an attacker actually, or a malevolent organization, for instance. And what we kind of quickly found, so this is doing a similar type of analysis. So one thing we kind of focused on, for example, is if someone is actually able to maybe find out your fitness tracker information, maybe because you post it on the leaderboard, or you posted your run online. Then if you post this information, one example is the risk of stalking. Once again, that's pretty important. Then if you post, let's say on Fitbit, you post the route that you jog every day, you post the floors that you climb, there might be some inferences there potentially linked to maybe your home address. There's also, I guess, this general concern about home burglary in terms of if someone knows where you started a run and where you end a run, and you post this information on a weekly basis for a few weeks, then someone might start actually to guess, well, that's probably potentially where the person lives, or they live close to that area. Especially they might actually start to predict, well, almost a kind of pattern of life, because you go for a run every Wednesday at this particular, between 6 and 7. Okay, then that's the perfect time to burgle your home, for instance. And then, of course, there's the much more somewhat devious side from the perspective that if maybe an organization that's a bit more mindful of, that's kind of quite potentially intrusive on their potential employees, for instance, they might check, potentially your height and your weight exposed by these platforms, maybe determine that you're at risk of obesity, or that you're pregnant, for example, looking at your heart rate data. And from that, they might actually not accept you for a job. So this is kind of, some bits like this are not necessarily a bit of a stretch, because all our inferences, all these lines is kind of backed up by research. But the key thing is here that these things are possible. So we need to be mindful, much more mindful actually, about how these dots are being joined together and the risks that it exposes to us. In this before, it was really linked to online data generally. Here it's really looking at social media data and fitness trackers in particular. Now, I guess one of the kind of concerns always is that, talks like this can be quite interesting, but then of course the question comes back, well, Jason, how do I know any of this stuff is accurate? How any of this stuff is actually happening in the real world? Here's kind of one example that's kind of hopefully should give you a perfect example that here's one reality, I guess, that give you a perfect example that things like this do happen. So some of you might have heard about this instance where the Strava Fitness app had potentially, or had been said to give away the location of a secret army base. And this was simply because individuals at this base, when they were doing training, they, I think unknowingly, basically, they turned on the GPS and they unknowingly uploaded this information online. Now, how this was detected by a researcher started to recognize that, hey, there is, sorry, I should also mention that Strava published basically a heat map of where people worked out the most. And then a researcher was actually able to kind of centering on this heat map, do some analysis, to basically reflect on it and recognize that there's a lot of kind of coordinated activity happening in an area where there's potentially where nothing should be happening. And from that, they were able to kind of detect that there was potentially a secret base there, and it turned out to be a secret US Army base. So here, once again, the idea is that the way how we're using devices, we're actually exposing more information than we know, and that example provides a perfect instance of it. This is also another interesting one, in that fitness trackers in particular are being used to set health insurance premiums. From the perspective that, so this is one example. I took this photo in the London Tube. So this says, track your health with Apple Watch Series 5 and get rewarded. Pay as little as £99 up front and so on. So the idea here is actually trying to, from some of these organizations, try to basically motivate individuals into working out more, which is perfectly fine. But then we also need to be mindful that some companies out there might actually be more interested in kind of the malevolent application of these technologies and not necessarily positive applications of these technologies. Now, from a passive perspective, looking at online identity, you also have, looking at the risk related to it. One topic that I've kind of focused on quite a bit of detail on is this idea about kind of the online advertising market space. And I mentioned this earlier in terms of the positives. And another thing to probably briefly discuss is some work here in terms of where we try to explore these to the extent to which the online, or basically the size of the online, let's say, advertising ecospace. Now, what we did in this bit of work was we explored what we did to understand the risk in this area. We basically took the top 250 websites in the US, UK, Japan, Russia, and Germany. And what we did was we looked at this top 250 we looked at the website from Alexa, and we basically tried to reflect on what third parties were these websites referencing. So what third parties were they making references to? So if I visit a website, what websites was that website then visiting, potentially on my behalf? And I'll just kind of skip, but that's the kind of essence of what we did. And then we apply social network analysis once again to gain some understanding of, well, what are the key nodes? What are the key connections between nodes? Are there any prevalent identities? Or sorry, not identities. Are there any prevalent organizations maybe reoccurring or occurring more and more? So in this work, and this is just an example of the top 250 UK websites. So we found that by accessing to the top 250 websites, we kind of, the network that we were able to build using social network analysis based on these connections. And I should also mention that connections were, if I visit the website, what website did that visit? And the website that visit would basically be one connection. So for instance, if I visited Google and then Google visited another website on my behalf, that would be a connection between Google and that website. And that would be a directed connection. So we did that analysis, and what we found was that in total, the network generated from visiting the top 250 websites in the UK generated in a network consisting of over 1,000 unique domains with about 4,000 connections between them. So quite sizable when you think that we only visited the top 250 domains, but clearly they visited much more on our behalf. Now, of course, you can't probably understand much bits of this, but probably what I'll focus on here. So we did, or we just created a tag cloud, a word cloud, to represent who were the kind of key or most prominent entities in that interaction. And we recognize that probably to little surprise, that there are a number of big companies in there. So for example, we have DoubleClick, Google Analytics, Google Syndication, Google.co.uk, and so on. And we also have Facebook, but we also have a number of other companies, so NXS. There's also advertising.com. There's also Rubicon Project. And when you kind of, and there's Demdex and so on, when you kind of delve into these, you can actually then recognize that a number of these are actually linked to kind of advertising networks. Now, where this is really interesting is because it really highlights the extent to which there's a kind of a significant and quite substantial online advertising ecosystem. Here is kind of the top most referenced websites in the US, Germany, Russia, and Japan. So probably the ones to highlight is if you focus just on the top 4 from each of those countries, you'll see that basically DoubleClick and Google and Facebook occur. Of course, DoubleClick and Google, their relationship. But also you see some interesting things. Firstly, you see Yahoo Japan being quite significant. To be honest, we were very surprised about that in general, the Japanese network was actually much smaller than we expected. But when we did some analysis on this, we found out that actually in Japan, even though the internet penetration is significantly, is substantially, is very high, we recognize that actually a lot of their advertising is still done by television and traditional media. And then we also recognize that there's instances, so for example, in Russia, you have Yandex and Yadro and so on also appearing in the top 4. Now, the last bit of kind of work I want to mention to you is kind of this idea of smart devices and smart tech and the identities and the risks related to that. So, I mean, yeah, I'm sure everyone would have seen that. So one thing we're very interested in understanding the extent to which individuals actually use these online platforms on these online let's say connected devices, and the extent to which they perceive privacy related to the use of them. So we did a small bit of work, basically trying to understand user perceptions and behavior when it comes specifically to smart devices and Internet of Things devices. Now, here are some kind of key quotes that individuals kind of came back with when we kind of interviewed them. So one, for instance, mentioned, I feel like someone would maybe be stalking me, which would be a bit unnerving. So this is actually let's say they're using certain smart devices, so for example, smartwatches. Probably the last one, there's certainly a cultural norm of saying privacy is important, which maybe doesn't always translate to reality or action. Now, I think that is a really salient point because, you know, a lot of individuals were very keen that privacy is important to them, but when we try to actually understand their behavior in the context of privacy, it showed this massive gulf. And this, of course, is some work that people very familiar with called privacy paradox. And individuals say they care about privacy, but then in terms of their action, it would actually be very, very different. So this is actually a problem that we decided, hey, this is really interesting. Maybe we should unpack this a bit further. And what we did was we kind of focused on understanding, and we kind of drilled down particularly in smartwatches, because these are devices that are used more and more these days, in combination with things such as voice assistants. Smartwatches are extremely popular, especially linked to the Apple Watch in particular. So what we did was we tried to develop a smartwatch privacy game to basically explore whether we can actually improve privacy behavior. So this is actually trying to counteract some of these risks. We recruited 10 individuals. We loaned them some Android Wear devices, and we gave them it for 52 days. We logged background behavior, GPS, string lock, and permissions in terms of what apps they had installed. Now, you'll see the design of the experiment on the screen now. So basically, we give them the devices. We basically log their behavior. We basically developed a game for them to play, which actually was intended to improve their behavior. And then we did, at the end, basically test. We removed the game and let them actually use the device again to test, to basically do a post-test. And probably key thing that I'll mention here is that this is very different to some existing studies that only focuses on self-report, because here we're actually gathering how they use devices after training. Here's an example of how the game looks. So basically it's called Shotdash, and basically the point is to go out and get from point A to point B, and the number of different obstacles that you encounter throughout. For example, in some of these obstacles, you get told, as you see in the middle image, Bob, your GPS is on, therefore companies can infer your home address. Please disable your location. And this is how the game would occur, in that you could play the game, it would pop up, it would tell you to do stuff, then you would have to go into settings, turn them off or change them or add them. but they were all centered around this idea of GPS, permissions, and screen lock on the smartwatch. Now, to show you findings, I won't focus on that. I'll probably delve into this. The point is here that we were able to show that in the treatment group, the group that actually played our game, they were able, or some of the individuals are actually able to increase their behavior. Some individuals, one individual particularly, you'll see kind of participants see actually the behavior is completely opposite in terms of permissions, which was a bit surprising. And what we can conclude from this bit of work is that the game really did make some difference. And this bit of work is quite novel from the perspective of we give individuals these watches for a long period of time, so they really have some time to explore and to use them. So in terms of the risk versus the benefit, in some ways, I still think that there's probably too much risk there, and we need to address that a bit better. And this smartwatch game that I mentioned is one way in which we can do that, but it's clearly a lot more research that can be done in this space. I'm always happy to collaborate on any of the topics that I mentioned above, so please do feel free to reach out if you have any questions, or if you just want to get in touch. And I think that's it. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jason. There are a lot of questions for you.
Oh dear.
I will try to group them by topics. So first one is from Josh, and he's wondering what are the advantages and disadvantages of identity obfuscation?
Identity
obfuscation.
Oh, there are many, but it depends. I mean, that's a little bit of quite a broad question. Is there maybe something a little bit more specific? Because there are clearly a lot of benefits, and it clearly makes a lot of sense to do. The question is the extent to which you can sensibly do it and still maintain a fair use of particular services. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's a really difficult. I mean, yes, that would be the ideal. Just as simple as as much, for example, as complete anonymization. But then the key question is, how do you actually use these services, and what is the impact on the quality of service? Mm-hmm.
Andrew is going a bit deeper in the topic, and he's wondering what are the dangers of appearing fraudulent if you are hiding your identity online.
Yes, I mean, this is a very fair question. It's a very important question, because the risk is that the more you try to protect yourselves, potentially by installing maybe additional, let's say a classic example is ad blockers or something like this, then you kind of stand out quite a bit in these various different services. So the reality is that, unfortunately, some of these services that we interact with online are much more interested in gathering this additional information, and therefore might actually potentially view us as fraudulent. But it's a very difficult thing to do, because I do believe that, you know, each of us should have the privacy that we want. But then the reality is that when we use some of these services, they will have their own requirements from us. And for example, in the banking case that I mentioned, they may well determine that, oh, well, this device is used from a different domain. Maybe it's because you're logging in via Tor or something. Therefore, it will block you because it thinks that you're fraudulent.
Mm-hmm. So Tim is asking that for people who are aiming to preserve their anonymity online, is it worthwhile to invest in time in using anonymous browsers like DuckDuckGo or Firefox Focus?
Yes, I do think so. I would probably suggest doing it doing it as much as you can. One thing that I've recognized is that some services simply just don't work if you use browsers that are maybe anonymous browsers, or if you actually scale back the extent to which you're willing to let some of the websites track you. The websites simply don't work. They break for whatever reason, probably because they rely significantly on it. So I think the biggest issue is, yes, we can try to do it, and I would encourage individuals to try to do it, but the reality, the unfortunate reality is a number of services increasingly don't let you do it, because basically there are issues linked to how the site was built, the assumptions that the site makes about individuals logging in, and so on. And a lot of it somewhat comes down to quality, them trying to increase their quality of service while you're trying to be more private.
Should the people be worried about the new US laws that allows the use of super cookies and monetize the content?
To be honest, I don't know much about super cookies. It's something that I've been hoping to delve into a bit more detail on. So I honestly don't know. So it would probably not be appropriate for me to comment.
Okay, there are a couple of questions from Cyril. I think that they are related to the paper about identifying the key players.
Yeah.
And he's wondering if the individuals that you did analyze, they were in the same time zone, and also if there was any change in circumstances, like if they were getting divorced, married, or if they were single at that time.
Right. Okay. So yes, we believe that they're in the same time zone. Is a part. Of course, it's difficult to be 100% sure about this, but yes, we believe they're in the same time zone. They were an activist group that was bonded by a certain topic. So we were unable to be sure whether there was actually, let's say, closer relationships between individuals, because really once again, thinking about this whole topic of online identity, we were very mindful of their online identity and their privacy and their need for anonymity and so on. So only very basic information in terms of the connections between these individuals was used, and that's why, for instance, even in the graph that I showed, individuals were anonymized immediately. We were only cared about the interaction between them. So at the end of the day, we just had user 123 and the link to user 234 or something. We didn't really know that level of detail about individuals, but we were relatively confident that because the topic that drew them together was actually a topic linked to a particular country.
Mm-hmm. There's another question from Maria, which is not truly convinced that you can achieve truly anonymization if you want to use that data further.
Which data is that?
Any kind of data. So you cannot get any or perform any marketing if you cannot link the identity with individuals if you anonymize the data.
Yes. I mean, the reality is that this is why organizations, some organizations anyway, will be very keen on understanding as much about individuals as possible, because that's where the value is. Marketers and so on make their money. The way how they work is that the marketers make their money by understanding the demographic, ideally putting individuals in different groups, so they know that if one individual in that group, or if 5 individuals in that group bought a certain device, toy, game, whatever, the other individuals in that group of like-minded individuals might also be interested in that group. It's how basically online space works, and it's how organizations, it's how different companies make recommendations. So it is the reality of the current economy, really.
Mm-hmm. Cyril is also asking if there's any benefit in regulation like GDPR in ensuring that providers, they gather less information.
Yes, I think that can be helpful. I think the tricky bit, which we encountered even with the cookie notices, is that these exist, but once again, the reality is, firstly, do individuals read them? I think there was a study done that actually showed that none of these cookie notices potentially don't adhere to what they're saying, or they don't actually represent what's actually happening. So I think GDPR is a good idea. It has really good intentions. I think the following through side of things on how companies actually respond is also going to be quite important, in that we need to ensure that GDPR doesn't just exist, but companies are actually doing what they should be doing in terms of protecting individuals' data, in terms of offering them appropriate privacy and allowing them to actually, if they don't want to be tracked, to actually easily express that, as opposed to having to open a browser, open a particular tab, open a window, scan down pages and pages of content and so on. So that's really important.
Mm-hmm. There's another question from Mohammed, who is saying that thank you for the presentation, that it was perfect. And he's mentioning that you are gathering your own data sets. I think that he means in general, but he's wondering how you create and train the models.
I guess that's very dependent on a case-by-case basis, really. In some instances, so for some of the work that I've been involved in, we have done things actually very manually. So for instance, the work I mentioned when we talk about natural persona, that was actually all done manually, especially from the perspective that we had an enormous amount of features and a very small number of individuals in that data set, which often makes it extremely difficult to do machine learning or anything similar to that. But in some instances, of course, if it's appropriate, if the data set is of appropriate size, then you can try machine learning models, either supervised or unsupervised. So I think that the platform of things is there to be used. It's really all about how do you determine what's most appropriate, and that has to be decided based on what data you have and the features and characteristics of that data.
Mm-hmm. Tim is also wondering if you consider in your research the concept of levels of assurance, which they give different weights to different identity providers, like they are specified in the NIST and the ISO frameworks. I'm not sure if that relates to your research. I'm not familiar with those, so I'm not sure if you are, Jason.
Unfortunately, I am not very, I remember a little bit of stuff with identity assurance, but it's not something I've looked into a great detail on, to be honest. So once again, I probably couldn't answer that adequately. But thanks, it's something that I can follow up on.
Okay, I think that with that, we have covered most of the questions. So thank you very much, Jason, again.
Thank you.
It's great to have you with us, and we hope to see you next year. Probably, or we hope it's going to be in a specific location.
Yeah.
And for all the attendees, we have 3 days more of conference. So please join us whenever you have some time, and we hope to see you there.
Thanks.